Hi, AJ. We'll get started shortly, just waiting for folks to enter the meeting. We'll just give another minute or two for folks that are still coming in.
AJ, your voice sounds like a high-pitched squeak. It's inaudible. Inaudible?
Yeah, sometimes that happens, and that must be better now.
There we go. Yep.
Excellent. I'm thinking of going to the Fern at 7:30 to see this blues guitarist. So I have to be home to like do dog stuff. You want to go, Craig?
That's very kind. I'll ask Holly.
Yeah. I don't know, some middle of the week low cover charge gig.
What's the fern?
It's a little speakeasy, a little roadhouse here in Stockbridge.
Oh, very cool.
Very sweet little
Good
place.
for middle of the week.
Yep, unusual for them, but they do have
Yeah.
a lot of traveling artists.
We'll give it another minute or so, and then I'll get started, and folks can just enter as they come in. Are you all able to see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. So we'll go ahead and get started, and we'll just start with brief introductions. My name is Kyle Katz. I am a regional planner at the Two Rivers Ottaquechee Regional Commission. I'm also a certified floodplain manager, so I do a lot of work with flood-related projects, flood regulation updates for many of the towns in our region. I assist towns with updating their hazard mitigation plans. And more recently, I've been working on a project in a few of our towns called the Resilience Initiative for Vermont Empowerment and Recovery. And that's working with engineers on flood mitigation projects for the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. So before we dive in, since we're a pretty small group, I'd just like to hear a little about who's attending, and if you're on a commission or a committee, what town you're representing, and your interest for the training. And I guess we can maybe start with AJ.
Hi, I'm AJ Rubin. I'm on the Pittsfield Select Board. and I'm a neighbor of Craig Westling. And I'm also the town zoning administrator, which, I'm looking forward to learning more about that. But those are my roles here.
Excellent. Thanks, AJ.
Hi, Kyle, Craig Westling. I also live in Pittsfield. I'm on the Planning Commission. And I also live really close to a river, so it's interested in that. But I joined the Planning Commission partly to be able to somehow impact affordable housing in our town at some point in the future.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll we'll be diving into I it seems like everyone is looking at flooding these days. So we'll be looking at a number of different topics. Some of them branch on zoning. Others look at more what are some concrete on the ground projects that can be undertaken and are undertaken every year in towns across our region. So um, without further ado, we'll get started. Feel free to, if you have questions, I may not be able to see you on my screen, but you can either save them for the end or you can chime in during the presentation. I'm fine with either. Okay. So our agenda for today, this training will explore ways in which towns can prioritize flood resilience through planning and project identification. So we'll start by setting the context for flooding in Vermont, looking at why flooding, why the intensity and frequency of floods is likely to get worse, and the cost and frequency of flood events and the historical patterns of development, how those impact flooding in our region. We'll then review actions available to towns, whether planning through the town plan or the local hazard mitigation plan, or identifying potential projects and funding sources. We'll also look at community participation in the National Flood Insurance Program and how this and the Flood Safety Act of 2024 help to improve flood resilience and flood safety for development in our towns through the regulation of development in floodplains and river corridors. And we'll briefly cover examples of flood resilience projects and typical funding sources. And then finally, we'll open the training up to questions and discussion. Just as a clarifying note, most of the photos and images used in this presentation are either from the Two Rivers Occoquechee Regional Commission photo archive, or they were taken by me. Where photos have been used from elsewhere, they're cited in the sources page at the end of the PowerPoint. And this PowerPoint will be made available following the presentation as a PDF. There are a number of links throughout the PowerPoint that take you to various pages of information. Many of them are Vermont government pages, such as floodready.gov. And so this presentation is a useful guide for navigating a lot of the flood information that's out there. The photo, so as I mentioned, a lot of the photos are taken from our region. This is a photo that I took last June of a stacked tow. It's a type of armoring in Bridgewater Center leading up to a bridge. And stacked tows are often used to protect roads, bridges, and development that may be close to our streams and waterways.
Kyle, I have a question just about this, a stacked toe. That's something that's positive.
It's often something that's necessary. It has its benefits and drawbacks. I think that it's possible, it's in a way it's constricting where that river can go or that stream can go and where the water wants to go. But also much of our infrastructure is not moving. It's, the roads are pretty much going to stay. If it's a main road that's used by a lot of people, that's going to get armored, because often we have no alternative location for that road to go. So yes, it's a way of protecting the infrastructure that we have.
Thanks.
So we'll start by taking a look at the numbers. So Vermont has seen an increase of 6 inches of precipitation and 2.4 more days of heavy precipitation per year since the 1960s. We're also on track to see a 52% increase in extreme precipitation in the Northeast by the end of the century. That's according to a study published in the journal Climate Change in 2023. And this may be due to the air is getting warmer and its ability to hold more water, and thus increasing the likelihood of intense precipitation. So the higher levels of water in the air, precipitation, coupled with more events, means that we're more likely to see more frequent flooding that's either localized or across the state. And this will likely translate into increased damage and costs associated with repair and recovery. This line chart on the right shows historical National Flood Insurance Program claims per year in Vermont. And you can see how, most years it's pretty low. There's roughly approximately 7.5 million in claims between 1980 and 2010. And then in 2011, it shoots up to approximately 53 million, largely due to Tropical Storm Irene. See it ebbing again until 2023, when it goes up to approximately 43 million for the July 2023 flood. A lot of the more frequent and higher precipitation events, it's likely to be less predictable. And so we won't necessarily know when another Irene will happen or another July 2023 flood will occur. But we do know that it will happen again. And so building resiliency in our communities is very important to lower the costs of due to the damage, and the need for recovery. Okay, so how did we get here? Well, now we'll take a little just look at the historical context of Vermont's pattern of development. It doesn't take a historian to look around and look at our typical villages throughout Vermont and see that they often concentrated around waterways. We've got our transportation networks that typically follow rivers and streams. These tend to be the most accessible areas where we could put our roads. And in earlier times, our rail. We tended to concentrate early industry around rivers. They generated power for a lot of that early industry that we had. And as such, if we're concentrating a lot of our development around these rivers, our housing and other infrastructure follow. And then coupling that with the fact that Vermont, its topography can be very challenging. And we have lots of very narrow valleys surrounded by mountain ranges. So often the most suitable places to build were near to or along rivers. So here, these are just some examples of towns throughout Vermont and various types of infrastructure within those towns that are located near rivers. So I'm sure many of these are recognizable. The Winooski in Montpelier, you have a mix of roads, businesses, residences. all along a very heavily constrained section of the Winooski. And then you have the Neshobe River in Brandon, where it looks to be a historic dam of some sort. Also a very channelized section of the river surrounded by development. There's a White River in Bethel. You can see roads, buildings, all in close proximity, and then Bradford Falls and the hydroelectric dam there. Okay, so we'll take a look at some historical context because with flooding, we've been here before, and often the spaces, the development that's flooded before has flooded again. You know, it's been these repeat flooding events that occur time and time again, often in the same places. So we've had 4 or 5 significant floods in the over 100-year period. The chart on the top right indicates the estimated cost in millions for the most significant flood events since the 1927 flood, which is considered to be the most devastating flood in Vermont. And Vermont has experienced flooding in between these periods, but it's been smaller floods, more localized. This chart just gives an estimate, but it helps to give a sense of scale of each event in today's dollars and what we can likely expect in the future. So I think it's important to note we've had 5 big flood events within roughly 100 years. Floods like that of 2011 or 2023 will happen again. But we will probably also likely see more frequent, smaller, more localized floods than we have in the past. So these images give a sense of the level of impact of flooding for many of the previous floods that we've seen. And each column represents a different flood. So the flood of 1927 are the 2 images on the far left. On the top, that's an image of the Main Street Museum in White River Junction during the 1927 flood. And you can see a lot of that, you know, the flood water has gone up and over and onto the road. It's going into nearby buildings. So that was a pretty significant rise in flood level. And then below that, there are some homes and a bridge that have been heavily damaged by the 27 flood. And here in the second column, we have the White Codge snack bar over in right below the Two Rivers office in Woodstock, damaged in the 1973 flood. The White Codge snack bar also was damaged in 2011 during Irene and 2023. And then I think this bottom image is impressive because it gives a comparison of, on the left, the 2011 damage for a section of road in Stockbridge, and on the right, that same section of road, you see that same house in the background, damaged in the 1973 flood. So we're seeing this repeated damage often in the same places. You all may be familiar, being from Pittsfield. This top image here during Tropical Storm Irene shows several homes that were moved off their foundations during Irene. And then the bottom image is the Quechee covered bridge that was partially destroyed during Irene. And yeah, I'm using a lot of images from the same locations to really emphasize the point that these places have flooded time and time again, and they'll likely flood to similar extents in the future. So the July 2023 flood, you can see that floodwater is really going. Fortunately, it was not as high as Irene, and the bridge was okay in Quechee. And then the top image is actually taken from a bridge over the White River in White River Junction, very near to that first image of the Main Street Museum. And so it gives a sense of, the 2023 floodwater was quite high, but not to the extent that it went over the banks and as in the 27 flood. Okay, so now we'll take a look at some of the impacts of flooding in Vermont. So flooding can impact our communities in a number of ways. This first photo is of a buyout in Plymouth following the 2023 flood. I'll just have you note the amount of rocky debris that is piled up behind the house, and entirely covering pretty much half of this car. Essentially what happened is the stream that was running down the mountain jumped its bank and created a new channel directly behind the house, pushing all the rocky debris into it. So this house was not in the flood zone. It just, flooding and the location of where floods will occur is becoming less predictable. And so, when the stream created a new channel, it ended up behind this house. We're also seeing damage to roads, bridges, culverts, and other infrastructure. So the floodwater can erode and scour banks, threatening a lot of our development. Here on the bottom two images, on the left, you can see some riverine erosion that is threatening a large barn-like structure, and you can kind of see on the other side that there are structures threatened as well. As a photo from following Tropical Storm Irene. And then on the bottom right, that's a photo taken of Route 132 in Sharon, also Tropical Storm Irene. And for some perspective, that's a person on the right-hand corner. So it gives a sense of how much erosion occurred to the road in this part of our region. And there are also threats to public safety. So flooding and floodwater, especially flash flooding, can be very dangerous and can cause injury or death, while more recent floods have been less deadly. In the 1927 flood, there were approximately 80 fatalities. So it puts in perspective, we've had a handful of fatalities in Irene and the 2023 flood. Fortunately, many fewer than 1927, but it's still a possibility, and floods are still very high risk. And then economic and environmental impact. So flooding can cause businesses to close, either temporarily or permanently. They can force relocation of those businesses. They can put people out of work. This means lost wages and revenue for businesses, coupled with high repair costs. So the photo on the top right shows several businesses in West Woodstock, very near to, actually way in the background is the white cottage that we saw in the previous slide. And this photo is taken from 2023. It just shows the impacts to local businesses that flooding can have. Finally, flooding can also lead to debris, trash, propane tanks, chemicals, other materials entering the waterway. Often our flood regulations will prohibit or have strict requirements on the storage of materials outside. And so this is one way to mitigate some of these materials getting into our waterways, but it still does occur. So where do we begin? Well, everything starts with good planning. This means ensuring that the town plan and hazard mitigation plan are routinely updated, that they're kept up to date. These plans are where policies and strategies for reducing future flood impacts are located. So explore ways to improve existing regulations. So language in the town plan or local hazard mitigation plan can support the strengthening of local flood regulations. All of the towns in our region have flood regulations. They can be of varying degrees of strictness. So FEMA sets the minimum standards for flood regulations, but towns can go above and beyond this. And we'll get more into that later in the presentation. So strong policy and recommendation language creates a basis for improving bylaws, flood regulations, and other regulatory and non-regulatory actions. And so it's important to make sure that these plans have the enabling language to allow the Plan Commission to do the work that you want to do. So this language could include broader policy statements around periodically reviewing and updating the flood regulations to improve the safety of homes, businesses, and other infrastructure in the mapped floodplains. It could also include specific recommendations such as requiring 2-foot freeboard for new or substantially improved structures in the floodplain. It can also improve not allowing net fill, and I'll get into some of these. They're called higher standards. I'll get into some of those shortly. So it's important to identify existing hazards and methods to mitigate them in our planning processes. So identifying vulnerabilities in our communities, vulnerable infrastructure, calling those out is a good way to get started on taking an action to address those and mitigate them before they become a problem. And then be proactive. So good planning can reduce the future costs of flooding. This photo on the right, that's a photo of riverbank erosion in Woodstock. And that erosion was threatening a water line at the Riverside Mobile Home Park in 2024. And then a bank armoring project helped to reinforce that bank, protecting the water line from becoming exposed. So that's another example of a stacked tow that was used to essentially armor the bank and protect that water line. So now we'll get into the National Flood Insurance Program. All of participation in the program is voluntary. All of our towns, all the towns in our region do participate. In order to participate, towns are required to adopt flood regulations that meet the FEMA minimum requirements. These requirements specify things like structures need to be elevated to the base flood elevation. And they specify that permits are required for all development in the special flood hazard area. And also that development be constructed in ways that minimize flood damage. Participation also in the NFIP also means that towns adopt the FEMA flood insurance rate map and any accompanying flood insurance studies. So the FEMA, I'll call it the FIRM, the flood insurance rate map is abbreviated as the FIRM. And it delineates the areas regulated under local regulations. So it's the map that the administrative officer, the zoning administrator, uses to determine if a development is in a flood zone or not. So I've included an example on the right-hand side. That's a close-up of a FEMA FIRM map for Stratford. And Orange County, unlike other parts of the state, does not have a digital flood insurance rate map yet. They still rely on the paper map. And so this is the map that towns in Orange County will see. it has various zones in it. It has Zone A, Zone AE, and Zone A it does not have the base flood elevations delineated. So those would need to be delineated for development. Sorry about the cat. Whereas Zone AE, you can see that it does have these cross sections that show the base flood elevation. So 969, 966, 964 as it's going down the west branch of the Pompanesett River. So some of the benefits of participating in the National Flood Insurance Program: residents are eligible for flood insurance. You do not need to be located in a flood zone to purchase flood insurance, but your town does need to participate. Future development in flood zones must be built to safer standards. So that's part of adopting those flood regulations. You're requiring development in areas that are prone to flooding meet certain development standards that you wouldn't have otherwise if you were not participating. And the National Flood Insurance Program also helps with the Emergency Relief Assistance Fund. Oh, I apologize for the cat. And the Emergency Relief Assistance Fund, essentially, it's funding that towns can receive following a federally declared disaster for public assistance. And I'll go a little more into that later in the presentation. But essentially, this is one of the requirements for receiving additional assistance through ERAF. Okay, so as I mentioned, FEMA sets the minimum flood regulation requirements for participation in the NFIP, but towns can go above and beyond and adopt higher standards than what the FEMA minimum requires. And I've listed a few of these here on this slide. So the first one is prohibiting net fill. And net fill essentially allows for incremental filling of the floodplain over time. And this can push the floodwater elsewhere. So it can push it to impact other development inside or even outside the flood zone, and put other property at risk. So by prohibiting net fill, you say, you can maybe still allow new development, but whatever fill you put in, you take out an equal amount, so it offsets that. It doesn't allow for that floodwater to be pushed elsewhere. And then increasing elevation and floodproofing to 2-foot freeboard. Now, freeboard is when essentially the FEMA minimum standard is that development be located at the base flood elevation. And this simple diagram on the right helps to illustrate that. So if you have a base flood elevation of 24 feet 6 inches, then the first floor elevation is at 24 feet 6 inches. So that flood water at the base flood is essentially at your front door. By requiring 2-foot freeboard, you go up 2 feet, and all of a sudden, your first door is a little bit higher, and it provides some flexibility and a buffer for if you have a more significant flood. Another option for local regulations is prohibiting new residential and commercial structures in the special flood hazard areas. Not building new structures in these areas is the safest option. It's not required that towns do this. Some towns in our region do, others don't. But if you're not building in the flood zone, those are all structures that are not at risk. They're maybe built outside of the flood zone and further from streams and rivers that could flood. Finally, requiring that critical facilities be located outside of the special flood hazard area. So critical facilities are those facilities that are vital to public health. These include police stations, fire and rescue facilities, among others. So elevating these higher up or relocating them outside the floodplain entirely can better protect critical facilities, allow them to operate without interruption during flood events. This is just a breakdown in the timeline for adopting or revising, updating flood regulations. Typically, there's a 1 to 2 year adoption timeline from when the Planning Commission starts working on flood regulations to adoption. This timeline can vary significantly, especially with flood regulations, because it often depends on how much they're being revised. It can be just a few small tweaks, putting in a few higher standards, or it can be an entire overhaul. And so that could be a big factor in the amount of time that it takes to go through this process. Regional planning commissions are a great resource for this. We can assist with drafting and scheduling and organizing public hearings. So the flood hazard area drafting starts with the Planning Commission. Once there's a draft in place, the Planning Commission will hold a hearing. This typically takes 2 months because it needs to get scheduled. There's a warning and notice that requirements that take time. And this could be extended if people show up to the hearing, there are comments, and the Planning Commission needs to revise or wants to make revisions following the hearing. Following the Planning Commission, the draft is transmitted to the Select Board, and the Select Board will hold a hearing, make changes, and then adoption is fairly simple. Adoption can occur at a regular meeting of the Select Board, or it could take place via Australian ballot. The DEC floodplain managers are an excellent resource. They will review draft bylaws for compliance to make sure that they meet FEMA minimum standards. And then I have linked in this slide the DEC municipal assistance page where you can find template flood hazard area regulations and also a template for river corridor regulations as well. Okay, so you may or may not be aware, but FEMA is publishing new flood maps for the entire state of Vermont. These maps are being prepared by Watershed, and the prep deadline is between 2027 and 2028. And so we can expect work maps in our region over the next year or two. And some of these maps may include new detailed studies. So parts of the white may have a new detailed study. The link at the bottom of this page provides more information on these studies and the map rollout by county. So you can dig into which parts of the state will be getting these more detailed studies at floodtraining.vermont.gov. A very small portion of the state has work maps so far. So I've pulled the work map, the draft FEMA map for Vernon, Vermont, way in the south. And so the top map is actually the current FEMA firm map. And you can see that it's very flowy. And that it's not heavily detailed. But if you look at the bottom, which is the bottom map, which is a draft, you can see that there's more precision there, and that there's some more detail, and a lot of this has to do with The new maps are using 1-foot contour data versus the 20-foot contour data. And so you have a level of detail that wasn't available for the current FEMA map. The Flood Safety Act, or Act 121, was passed in 2024 and looks at improving flood resilience across Vermont. So according to the Act, 70 to 80% of flood-related damage occurs within the state-designated river corridor. As such, much of the Act addresses river corridor protections. The Department of Environmental Conservation is charged with regulating river corridors across the state. And state implementation of these regulations is set to begin in 2028. So while towns have always had the option to adopt river corridor regulations, the state will be having these go into effect and will require state permitting similar to the state wetland permitting process in 2028. Just to go into a little of the difference between river corridor regulations and the FEMA flood regulations. So river corridors are a Vermont level of regulation, while the FEMA regulations are federal. And the FEMA regulations primarily look at elevation. How high up is the development in relation to that base flood? While river corridors focus on the movement of rivers over time. And so I've provided these 3 images as an example of how rivers can move laterally over time. And it's all the same image taken at different points in time, 2003, 2016, and 2023, from a portion of the White River in Randolph, Vermont. And the red overlay is the river corridor area. And so you can see the river corridor, how it's mapped. And so in the 2003 image, I have highlighted a driveway in red hatch. Just below, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it's just below the red river corridor overlay. In 2016, the river has moved, encroached on that driveway, and a new driveway was created, which can be seen as the orange hatched line. And the 2023 image shows that change over time from 2003, that green line showing the river change, to 2016, which is the blue line. That was the path of the river in 2016. And then 2023, the white line showing how that path of the river changed in 2023. And so you can see that in a 20-year period, the river has moved significantly, putting property at risk, putting driveways at risk. And actually, the second driveway is no longer there because of the riverine erosion that's occurred. One more thing to add for the Flood Safety Act, there will be new rules for special flood hazard areas. The state will be creating its own minimum standard that towns would need to adhere to. It would likely include some higher standards. So it's probable that towns and planning commissions will need to examine their flood regulations and make revisions in the near future. Although what the new state standards will be, we don't know yet. Okay, so types of projects. There are numerous types of flood mitigation projects, but for this presentation, we'll just look at a few. The first that we'll look at is the FEMA buyout program, and this provides a way to finance the removal of damaged and at-risk commercial and residential structures. It's essentially the sale of the property to the local municipality based on the pre-flood market value of the structure. Um, it's not the municipality that's purchasing it outright. It's typically through FEMA hazard mitigation grant programs, so it's primarily funded by FEMA. And this program gives property owners essentially a way out of a difficult situation, and it removes the risk of future damage to structures that have already been impacted or destroyed entirely by flooding. So the top two images, the one from the Farmbrook Motel in Stockbridge, those are images of buyouts from Tropical Storm Irene. The Farmbrook Motel had a stream going underneath it, and that essentially blew out the bottom of the motel, and it became a buyout as a result. The Stockbridge image has a blue line about 10 feet up, and that is that's the level at which the water was at on that house. So it gives a sense of the scale of the flooding at that location during Irene. So the second type of project that we'll talk about is floodplain restoration. This can help to restore access to areas of floodplain. It can attenuate the flow of flood water, slow it down, and better protect homes and infrastructure downstream. And so this first image on the bottom left from 2023 is actually the image of the Farmbrook Motel site. The motel is no longer there, and instead it was put back as a floodplain. It was restored with root wads and was planted with willow cuttings. And so now it has increased the flood storage capacity in this section of Penny Hollow Brook in Plymouth. We'll look at two more types of flood mitigation projects. The first, we've talked a little about this, is bank armoring and stacked tows. So this first up on the top two images are of a stacked tow in Bridgewater. It was part of a Better Roads grant for fiscal year 2024. The grant was for $40,000 with a $10,000 local match, and total cost was approximately $67,000. It was about 10 feet wide, 14 feet high, and 150 feet long. So it gives a sense of the scale of the project. And these, as I mentioned previously, can help to protect infrastructure such as roads, buildings, and utilities. In this case, it's protecting a road from slope erosion that was taking place at that site. The bottom two images are from a culvert upsizing project in Heartland. They're part of a V-Trans Structures grant. It was essentially replacing a 30-inch culvert with a 13-foot by 8-foot by 72-foot concrete box, so a box culvert. And I think it's impressive seeing the before and after this very small 30-inch culvert in a stream that was meant for a much larger structure. And again, similar to bank armoring, these just help to prevent damage to infrastructure like roads. If you get heavy flash flooding, that could blow out the road, and it could isolate individuals or residents for long periods of time. So by upsizing the infrastructure, it mitigates the possibility of that occurring. Okay, so we'll just look at a little into the funding sources for some of these projects. A lot of the funding comes from FEMA, and much of it is disaster-based. So that essentially means that following a federally declared disaster, FEMA provides funding in the form of a hazard mitigation grant program or public assistance. Now, the hazard mitigation grant program, it provides a 75% cost share with a 25% local match, and it's administered by Vermont Emergency Management. Towns apply for these projects, which can include buyouts, elevations, floodproofing, floodplain restoration, dam removal, infrastructure, and bank stabilization. FEMA public assistance is another form of disaster-based funding that covers municipal buildings and infrastructure, roads, local roads, debris removal, and emergency protective measures. I mentioned ERAF, Emergency Relief Assistance Funding, earlier in the presentation. Towns that have that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program and that have met other criteria, including local emergency management planning, local hazard mitigation plan, get an additional share of funding covered by the state. So FEMA covers 75%. Typically, towns are on the hook for 17.5%, but if towns have their planning in place and they participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, they get additional funding covered by the state. And then on top of that, if towns participate in adopt river corridors, the town share of ERAF drops to 7.5%. So that means if there's a $1 million disaster, towns are on the hook for 75,000 versus 125,000. There's also emergency watershed protection. This is federal funding. It's from the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and it typically covers riverbank stabilization and severe erosion. So a lot of the bank armoring type projects that may be lower priority for FEMA would get funded by can get funded through the emergency watershed protection. And there's non-disaster-based funding, which is flood mitigation assistance. So that doesn't require there to be a disaster in order to get that funding. But towns need to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. And this funding is nationally competitive, so it can be difficult to get. Some other state level funding sources, and these are more geared toward roads and other infrastructure. We have the Town Highway Structures Program, which is for the maintenance and construction of bridges, culverts, and other structures. The Town Highway Bridge Program, that's for repairing larger bridges. There's no project cap on these, and the match can vary. And the Better Roads Grant. That, as we saw earlier, can be used to correct stream bank or slope erosion on town roads, putting in a stacked toe to prevent bank scour, things like that. VTrans publishes an incredibly informative guide that details eligibility for these programs and other similar transportation programs it's called the Show Me the Money Guide, and it's linked in this slide. So to summarize, everything starts with planning for future flood impacts. It's important to incorporate strong policy and action language into the town plan and the local hazard mitigation plan, because this language then enables the Planning Commission, the Select Board, other entities in town to take action. This can include language on exploring strengthening local regulations in flood-prone areas, which many towns in our region will likely need to do the next few years due to the Flood Safety Act. explore pursuing flood mitigation projects, understanding that these may require local administrative capacity. So it's important to, if you're looking at a concrete, a specific project in town, that there's local capacity to administer it. And then always reach out to the Regional Planning Commission or other regional and state resources if you have questions on projects, funding opportunities, or grants that are out there. So as your local RPC, we're always happy to help. With that, we have a additional resources slide that I can send along following the presentation. It will be available on our website as well. And this is just a great repository of links to a lot of the flood safety, flood resilience pages for the state of Vermont. Two Rivers put together an excellent video on buyouts. It's 10 minutes long, but I highly recommend watching that. It's incredibly informative and goes into more detail than I could today on the FEMA buyout program. And then just sources used for various slides and my contact information. And so with that, I'd just like to hear from if there are any questions or comments following the presentation. I'm happy to answer. Looks like we have a couple more folks that join. It looks like Bill and Eric.
I have just kind of a general question in terms of looking at the funding landscape. Is there anything that's on your radar that would put these funds at risk, or do they look safe, or what's your read?
So one issue that we have right now, and I didn't go into it because it's no longer a funding source, the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities Fund. Now that was used for similar projects. It was used for culvert upsizing and projects like that. That was non-disaster based, so you didn't need a disaster to get that. It was through FEMA. But that was also the funding used for developing and updating hazard mitigation plans. So it's unclear right now where towns will get funding to update these plans. And a lot of these grant programs are contingent upon a town having an updated hazard mitigation plan. So you can see the challenge of if a town doesn't have funding to update it, updating it might be slower, it might take longer, and the plan goes out of date. And then if there's a disaster, it can be difficult to qualify for hazard mitigation funding as a result. So that's one that, yeah, is on my radar, and I don't know what the solution is for it. As of 2 weeks ago, the entire BRIC program was axed, so it's incredibly recent news.
Thanks.
All right, Bill, Eric, or AJ, any comments, takeaways, suggestions? Happy to hear.
This is Eric. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about being tardy here. I unilaterally changed the start time to 6:30 without sending out the memo to everybody. So you didn't get the memo that we were starting 6:30 instead of 6. But anyway, that aside, first of all, I want to, in that regard, ask if the slide deck is available. I presume it is.
Yeah, it will be. I have to convert to a PDF, and once I do that, I can send it out.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And when, in terms of timing, you might have said this earlier, and I apologize. What is the timing of FEMA's maps for our watershed?
It looks like I'm thinking 2027 is when we'll have a work map. But it could be, or sorry, 2026, but it could be even sometime this year. FEMA's kind of a black box, and I think even more so now with everything going on. So um, it's always been up in the air when the maps will come out. I just periodically check the ANR website for it because DEC is constantly updating if there are new maps available. So that's kind of my go-to source. But you know, I think they would also say that they're somewhat in the dark, and the maps come out. It's like, oh, here we are.
Yeah.
But it is a work map to begin with, so it's not, you know, the final product. And I think that the final maps will be 2027 or 2028.
Our plan is due for adoption in 2028, so it's going to be a close call on some of these issues. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yeah, and so regulations, your flood regulations should have language in it that automatically adopts the new FEMA flood map. So that by itself wouldn't trigger the need to update the flood regulations. I think more triggering that would be the state setting higher minimum standards for flood regulations than what FEMA sets and requiring towns to meet those standards. And we should have a sense in 2026 of what those will be.
Okay, good. Thank you for that.
Excellent. All right. If there aren't additional questions, I want to thank everyone for joining this evening. I hope it was informative. There was a lot to try and cover in one training, one sitting, but I do a lot of work with flood regulations, so I'd be happy to, you know, if towns are interested in exploring those or learning more about river corridor regulations, I'd be happy to attend a meeting and discuss that with, you know, with the Planning Commission and or whoever may be interested. So glad to follow up and dive into more detail on some of these topics.
Kyle, thanks for your time and this information.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Kyle.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Yes.
Take care.
All right. Maybe I'll see you later, Craig.